Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and sorry I can't be there with you. My name, as I've been introduced, is Bríd-Áine Parnell, and I'm a PhD student in designing responsible natural language processing at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm going to talk about online name misrepresentation. So the fact that many online systems do not fully accept names in languages other than English. So for the vast majority of the world, accurate representation of their name in digital text is not a given. So if you have a name in any one of many languages that use diacritics, you will struggle to get digital records to accept it. So from banks to government services to airlines, all industries in which your identity is really important, people are forced to create an anglicized version of their name. They have to strip out the diacritics in order to gain access to the digital world. So if they try to use, for example, the fada in the diacritic in Irish, or a circumflex, or a tilde, or any other so-called special characters, they trip the sort of culturally insensitive warning that you see on this slide. So whoops, that's not a name. The name can only contain letters, by which it means implies only what the system can read as a letter. But as I'm sure most of you know, diacritics don't just change the sound of a word, they also change its meaning. So the Irish name Sean is roughly equivalent to the English name John, but omit the fada and it becomes Shan, which is the Irish for old, or put the fada on the wrong vowel, put it on the E, and it becomes Shane, which is the Irish for omen or deny. So given that there is a semantic importance to this, why don't many systems accept them? We've all heard today about Unicode, so we're aware of this standard that allows digital text to represent multiple scripts and therefore many languages. And this has been around since the 90s, and it's continually being added to and improved, not only in terms of the scripts and languages that it supports, but also in the associated tools and libraries and software developed by the Unicode Consortium for Localization and Globalization. So because of this work, modern databases and much associated software can all use Unicode, but in practice, they often don't. Technology is rarely implemented in one sweep. It's layered onto itself with older and newer systems mixed in, and older systems often underpinning the institution's entire infrastructure. So in this way, you may have an old database that is using, for example, an older language like COBOL that is restricted to ASCII, which was the American standard for information interchange that was the principal standard for English before Unicode came along. And then on top of that, you might have a cutting edge website, but it makes no difference because on the back end, you still need to transcribe everything into ASCII. And there's a range of reasons why these things don't get changed. So digital transformation is difficult and expensive for institutions. Storing and processing multilingual data is also expensive. So even if your database supports Unicode, you may not want to go to the expense or trouble of sourcing the associated software or buying the fonts. You're more likely to just choose the specific fonts you think you're most likely going to need. And then for official validated identities, there is an older standard in play. So the machine readable zone, which is on passports and other official IDs, you can see it here at the bottom of the passport, what looks like typewriter text. This is mandated to use OCR-B text, which is only available in ASCII. And this is so that those machines that you see at the airport can actually read this and decipher it very easily without any OCR errors. So Irish language names are my case study for reasons I'll come back to, but obviously Irish is not the only language affected by this issue, and nor is Ireland the only country in which citizens are fighting for their right to retain diacritics in their names in digital records. Here we see cases across Europe where people are willing to go to court for this principle, and many of them use the EU's GDPR rules, which offers a right to rectification for your personal data. About 6 years ago in Ireland, Irish citizens began their fight to have their fada shown on digital and official records. This started with traditional and social media campaigns that called out the various services that were refusing the fada. And they also made complaints to the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland under GDPR with the argument that the fada was an integral component of their name and so needed to be corrected. Eventually, even though some of these cases are still ongoing, the general legal and public pressure became enough to motivate the government to make amendments to its Official Languages Act. So as of 2025, the fada must be available for records with all public bodies. So this is things like universities and schools and the health executive. But the law stopped short of forcing commercial firms to update their systems to accommodate the fadas. And also it's a process. The institutions have time to update their systems as well. So in my initial study on this, I wanted to examine online name misrepresentation in the Irish context by surveying people with Irish language names. So I wanted to hear from them what were the emotional and societal impacts they felt and look at whether and where they were experiencing these digital errors. So for me, as I said, Ireland is an interesting and relevant case study, not only because it resonates with me personally, because of my own name, but also because of this recent campaign within the country. And because the country's historical experience of losing Irish as its dominant language under British colonial rule resonates with the online Anglicisation that people are being forced to perform today. And I'm going to come back to that later in the talk. So since independence, the Irish government has made a number of attempts unsuccessfully to re-establish Irish, and there is an official policy of bilingualism today, but English remains the dominant language on the island. Recent years, however, have seen a renewed artistic and cultural interest in the language, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland as well, which is part of the UK. And this is evidenced by films like On Colleen Kewen and rap group Kneecap, we might have heard of, and also by so-called new speakers of Irish. So these are often adult learners. They're outside of the traditional Irish-speaking regions. And they're constructing a sociolinguistic identity that positions the movement to speak Irish, not as trying to salvage this kind of imagined past or trying to preserve a state of language from the past, but as a right to speak any Irish within a context of decolonization. They see Irish speaking as just one aspect of their wider identity that's linked to their cultural heritage. And of course, names are not just about language. They enact an identity creation that comes with a social and cultural history. And forcing people to change their names to go online or to access the digital sphere in any way, it's a form of cultural erasure. It's a microaggression and a micro-iniquity that others them by pointing to their deviance from a supposed norm. And in this case, this is this Anglo-centric norm that we know is prevalent in the digital world. So to turn to the study, I conducted this over Prolific and by reaching out as well on social media through Irish language associations and activists and linguistic academics. I got 150 of my participants from Prolific and 78 from these secondary sources. And around half of my respondents were in the Republic of Ireland, just under a quarter in Northern Ireland, and the rest from England, Scotland, and Wales. So while all of the participants had Irish language names, 137 of them reported fada in their name. So first, it was very clear that having a fada in your name is significantly likely to lead to online name misrepresentation or rejection. So here we see 72% of people with fada in their name had this experience. The other 28% of people who also had the experience without the fada were generally those who had an apostrophe in their surname. So they were O'Connor or O'Connell or Gorman. When choosing from the types of impacts they experienced, people also did report unequal access to digital services because of their name, including delays, as well as the embarrassment of triggering those whoops responses. For example, they would say that they lost access to an account because they had anglicized their name in one way and then they couldn't remember which way they'd done it, and then they couldn't get back in and had to kind of start all over again. Given the campaign in Ireland, I had anticipated that there was going to be a strong connection for people with their Irish names, but I was still surprised by the strength of attachment that people had specifically to their fada. So 89% of respondents reported that the fada was either somewhat or very important to their name. And this like high level of importance implies that this cultural aspect is linked to their identity. So to go briefly theoretical, as Judith Butler said in her 1997 book, Excitable Speech, we as linguistic beings are called into existence as subjects when we are named. And although this book far predates any digital identities, she specifically mentions the bureaucracy of forms, drawing on Louis Althusser's interpolation account of how societal structures call out to us and thereby construct us. So Butler says that state forms imprint an interpolative name without any speaker, so producing a terrain of power that operates without a subject. In other words, there is a faceless bureaucracy that those with Irish language names encounter when they have to anglicize their names to fill in online web forms, or when they see their own name reproduced back to them in official documentation as anglicized or as otherwise incorrect. In free text about the incidents of misrepresentation they had experienced, participants implied that the anglicized versions of their names didn't really refer to them. Some participants, such as this one, eloquently reflected the injury of being misnamed, and others illustrated how the changed name was not really their choice, but something imposed on them, often despite their best and multiple efforts to correct it. However, when I asked people how they felt about it, there were some interesting results. The survey allowed respondents to choose from multiple emotions, and they could choose more than one, as well as the option to add more free text responses about their emotions. So I classed those who'd only chosen indifferent or mildly annoyed as feeling a weaker emotional response compared to any other emotion choices. And within this framework, I found that while respondents were statistically more likely to experience a strong emotional response when they had these experiences, there was an ambivalence at the individual level in both strong and weaker emotional respondents in the context of, that I think might be better understood in the context of coloniality and microaggressions. So Ireland has wrestled with its status as a post-colonial nation. For many theorists, there is a question of whether Ireland was a real colony or even what a colony is. And these are open theoretical questions. So there's therefore perhaps a spectrum in the extent to which any Irish person might consider themselves within a colonial context. So, for example, one participant reporting strong emotion also stated that they refuse to accept anything but my name, but usually if the fada isn't accepted, I'll spell it without the fada. And then they added, I feel ancestral trauma, honestly. Another claimed a feeling of lost culture I cannot get back. They said they had stopped using their fada from a young age due to issues with documentation. But now looking back at this, I've had to drop my culture for my own country. Whereas others talked about anglicizing their names, and they even used the word anglicization without explicitly linking that to any cultural or colonial history. Theoretical exploration of microaggressions has highlighted that they can be ephemeral and hard to prove. And some theorists have used this to question their impact, but others, including Samantha Brennan, with whom I'm a bit more aligned, have argued that despite the micro status of these infractions, cumulatively they are significant and they're part of the invisible power structures that reinforce social hegemonies. In this study, I felt that participants were demonstrating this tension. A number of them claimed dispassion in one instance, and then they showed stronger feeling in another context, such as in this passage from a participant who reported strong emotional response, but then said they don't try to use their fada. Or people would report strong emotions, but then they would qualify that it's no longer worth fretting about, or it's difficult for non-Irish people to get our names completely correct. Those who reported a weaker emotional response were less likely to give additional free text responses. However, they still showed significant importance of the fada to their names, and they strongly supported the idea that Irish should be accepted online, slightly more even than across the total number of respondents. So how can we reconcile this ambivalence, especially in light of the strong grassroots campaign that drove real change in Ireland? I would argue that on the one hand, there are these subjugating mechanisms of active colonial power that historically subdued languages like Irish, the same languages that today are often classed as minority or digitally disadvantaged. And on the other hand, there is coloniality as an ongoing structural system within which one people, culture, or economy is dominated and exploited by another. And these two ideas or systems are kind of entangled in these responses. If we were to imagine the digital realm as a country that we all wish to gain entry to, it is one that only allows for the seamless acceptance of those at the apex of these systems, and others instead experience a continued sense of unbelonging to various degrees. So within this reimagined digital space, the linguistic imperialism of English establishes an archetype for the right sort of citizen, situated at the top of a hierarchy that can trace its lineage back to active colonialism. Others studying digital text standards before me have made this connection, such as Daniel Pargman and Jacob Palm's discussion of English as the dominant language on the internet in their aptly named ASCII imperialism essay. However, they also, as do I, acknowledge that the use of English as a lingua franca online provides a necessary common ground for global communication and infrastructure. So in order to transmit information across the internet, we need to be able to speak with each other. And for that, we do need a lingua franca. And because of this, the structures that make Irish names with the fada diacritic difficult and all other languages with diacritics difficult, these are not seen as power structures or structures that require decolonization, but as technological ones. Many of the companies, when they were responding to these cases that were brought under GDPR, framed the scope of the challenge as an engineering one, to which the only answer they had was the best solution that could be accomplished within their timeframes, their costs, and the restraints of their digital systems. This is ongoing work, and it has a few different kind of strands that are building towards an infrastructure of digital text and naming. So I'm currently looking at the work of developers involved in government digital identity programs. These are programs that are being set up right now, and they provide an opportunity, I guess, to intervene if you would wish to update these kind of systems. So I'm interested in how they are conceiving of and designing these systems, how they're handling issues of interoperability and their own legacy technologies, and of course, how they handle multilingual names. I'm also looking at the making of the Unicode standard as a historical context for the digital text stack. So to my mind, this was a moment in which an intervention was made in how the digital text stack had been up until that point conceived of and designed, and quite a successful one. So what made that moment possible? I'm also investigating the technological impacts, particularly for natural language processing, looking at questions like how do we train multilingual large language models when many data sets are inaccurate? And how do current models process and store names, and are there differences for languages with diacritics? So in a sense, like, do LLMs have a different sense of names if they are represented graphically differently? Will data matching and processing produce bias for people whose names contain diacritics in one database but not in another, for example? So these are my kind of outstanding questions, but now I'll turn to you for your thoughts and questions as well. Thank you very much.
So much. That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm open for the questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for that great talk. I'm just starting to learn Irish myself, so yeah, I'm very interested in this topic. And I was, thinking about the overdot, which is, not used anymore. But do people have similar feelings or thoughts about, using or not using the overdot for addition in Irish?
So I would say that they did at the time that was removed. So I actually had occasion recently to dig into this a little bit, although it's not part of my main field of study. But so essentially, it was kind of brought through in the 50s and 60s, like. Yeah, it took like a couple of decades for them to eventually erase it entirely. And one of the reasons given was to do with printing. So in a way, it has these echoes with what's happening now, where the fada is disappearing because of digital text. And in that case, they were saying that it was more expensive or more difficult to print this this Lanishan dot. And it would be better to Latinize it and use the H instead. And it created this really unusual set of circumstances whereby parents couldn't help their children with their homework because it was written differently. And so a lot of people blame it actually as one of the reasons why attempts at that point of reintroducing Irish as the dominant language failed, because they were moving it more towards this Latin alphabet. But I don't think that people nowadays wish to bring it back in the same way as they care about fada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There was another question. Yes.
This is super interesting, and I really enjoyed your deep dive because I'm kind of aware of this as a broad question across like lots of Latin scripts with diacritics. But this kind of very deep dive was fantastic. I was just wondering whether you have linked up with other movements that are happening, or whether your research is linked up with other movements. Are there other movements happening elsewhere in the globe about this type of thing? So I have a Romanian friend who is really annoyed about not being able to use his diacritics and his name on Facebook, for example. So is there a possibility of this being more of a global movement, or
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, as I showed just a few cases in Europe, but this is just like GDPR has offered this really helpful mechanism to complain about this, but people have been complaining about it for some time. And I think partially it's like maybe ironically to do with the success of Unicode. So now that people can see that websites can be available in multiple languages, they wonder why their names are left out of this process. Why are they still remaining stuck kind of in the past? You know, people have really strong feelings about it because I didn't go into this so much as well, but like in naming research, there's strong familial connections, and it's often a way for migrants to keep a connection to their cultural past when they move. So there are just all these kind of entangled connections to your name and to your identity that are extremely important, even if you yourself don't no longer speak that language, and the name might still continue. So I do think that there are like lots of movements. I haven't connected with them in the sense of being active in them, but I am collecting information about them.
Thank you. There's another question.
We have
Yes.
okay. I was curious, I guess this is kind of two-pronged. If your research, also think that I'm very, very interested in this subject myself. First of all, if your research has looked at continuities with forms of kind of orthographic flattening that even predate computers, like, you know, like in English, for example, 16th century, we lose the thorn because continental European types don't have the thorn. But that, and then also tracking like what determines success in these movements. I know that in Spain, for example, in the 90s, there was a similar sort of thing with the Ine, because in the 80s, I want to say actually. In the 80s, there was imported home computers didn't support the Ine, and so there's a law passed, you have to support the Ine to be sold in Spain or whatnot. So I was curious if you had did any work on like what works, what doesn't, of like forcing the hand of the technologists.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, this is also very much my question, and I'm trying to figure that out because I think it is, you know, when when Unicode, when the group formed and wanted to do Unicode, they did upend the entire way that text was encoded. And like I said, that intervening moment somehow worked. And I would say there were aspects to do with commercial interests that helped to make that possible. I think the state interests as well are very much a part of this. And that's one of the reasons why government digital identity, I think, is also part of my work, is because, you know, it's to do with the standardization of state work and also the activity of the state to make a public legible. And so where they champion a minority language or a specific issue, it does tend to work. And where they ignore it or there is no championing, then it does fall by the wayside. So it does require campaigning on some level, either to the state or through commercial interests, in order to affect a change, I think, or to stop a change maybe as well. But yeah, certainly I'm ongoing interested in this, and anyone who wishes to email me with even cases they see online, do tell me.
Super. We'll do that. Thank you so much, Bríd-Áine.
Thank you very much.
I hope I've said that okay. And we move on to the next presentation. So, of course,